بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم
بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. So I just want to start by reading again another letter that Imam Ghazali he wrote to his disciples or students, and he starts off by saying أيها الولد, and walad obviously you know means child, oh child. And he's talking about ilm, he's talking about knowledge. So he says, لو كان العلم المجرد كافية لك. He said, if knowledge alone were enough for you, if knowledge alone were enough, ولا تحتاج إلى عمل سواه لكان نداء. He said, so if knowledge alone was enough for you, and you did not need any actions beside that, other than that, لَكَانَ نِدَاء, then the call, هَلْ مِنْ سَائِلٍ هَلْ مِنْ مُسْتَغْفِرٍ هَلْ مِنْ تَائِبٍ ضَائِعًا بِلَا فَائِدَةٍ. He says, then the call, هَلْ مِنْ سَائِلٍ. You know the hadith where the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he comes down the last third of the night. Obviously descent is not in the descent to be taken literally, but what the call here is explained in another hadith in Nasa'i, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he sends a herald, he sends a messenger angel, and the messenger angel calls out in the last third of the night, Hal min sa'il, where are those that are asking so that their request may be granted? Hal min mustaghfir, where are those seeking forgiveness so that their call or their request for forgiveness may be granted? Hal min ta'ib, where are those who are seeking tawbah so that it may be answered by Allah? If knowledge alone were enough and you did not need actions, these comments and these statements would be lost and they would have no benefit. They would have no benefit at all. So what that indicates is that a person, he has to act, he can't just know. So getting up in the middle of the night and asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is part of that light, it's part of that acting, it's part of that engaging, it's part of that performance. It's not simply a matter of knowing, Ya Allah forgive me, but that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He makes that call. Hal min sa'il, hal min ta'ib, hal min mustaghfir. Where are they? Where are they, those that are calling me? Where are they? And so this is an indication that actions are required, particularly at certain times. And what Ghazali is alluding to here, that he's alluding to that special time, that the more difficult the thing is to do, but it still needs to be done. And he gives an example. He says, رُوِيَ أَنَّ جَمَاعَةً مِنَ الصَّحَابَةِ رِضْوَانُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِمْ. He says, it is narrated that a group of the companions, ذَكَرُوا عَبْدُ اللَّهِ بن عُمَرٍ, they actually made mention of another companion, رضي الله عنهما, عند رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال. So they made a statement about a particular companion in front of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, and they فقال نعم الرجل, and what was said is نعم الرجل هو لو كان يصلي بالليل. So the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he made the comment and he said that what an excellent man he is if only he would pray at night. So Ghazali is making this comment, he's relating this hadith just to show a particular thing. So the Sahaba, they recounted the name of one companion, and the Prophet ﷺ says, نِعْمَةُ الرَّجُلْ هَذَا. He's a great person. لو كان يصلي بالليل, if he had prayed at night. وقال عليه الصلاة والسلام برجل من أصحابه. And the Prophet ﷺ said to another of his companions, يا فلان, يا فلان. He said to him, oh so and so, لا تكثر النوم بالليل. Don't sleep too much at night. لا تكثر النوم بالليل فإن كثرة النوم. Too much sleep بالليل تضع صاحبه فقيرا يوم القيامة. What the Prophet ﷺ said, a large quantity of sleep at night will leave the person a poor man on the day of resurrection. So what the Prophet ﷺ is saying in this particular hadith, which Ghazali has quoted, is that a person, he shouldn't sleep too much. There needs to be a portion and a portion. And there also needs to be a portion where he dedicates for ibadah. So in that, Ghazali, he says, وَمِنَ اللَّيْلِ فَتَهَجَّدْ بِهِ نَافِلَةً لَكَ. And that's a verse from the Quran. Ghazali is quoting these passages to say that, and part of the night keep vigil, keep a vigil, get up and pray as an optional thing. It's like a command, it's like a amr. وَبِالْأَسْحَارِ هُمْ يَسْتَغْفِرُونَ. And the Prophet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he also mentioned in the Quran that people, they seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's forgiveness bil ashar, and he mentioned this portion bil ashar. Now ashar, if you look at the word, and you definitely know the word sahur. Sahur is a person, he gets up right before fajr and he eats. So this word sahar and sahur, and where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he mentions it in the Quran, that these people who seek forgiveness bil ashar, he mentions this very word which indicates before fajr. So these people, they forsake their beds and they get up after forsaking their beds and they pray and they dedicate to Allah and they remember Allah. Very important time. So what Ghazali essentially is saying is that you cannot simply just have al-ilm al-mujarrad. It cannot just be simply knowledge alone. Knowledge alone will not suffice. Knowledge alone needs to have an internalized act, but an act certainly which is internalized. So we'll start or finish where we left off in terms of Imam al-Ghazali. Now, just to recap, so we mentioned that Ghazali, he's had an internal crisis. Many things led up to that crisis. There's an intellectual crisis. There is doubt that grips him. It overtakes him. It has physical manifestations upon Imam al-Ghazali. We see even in the incident of the man who came to rob Ghazali when he was in the caravan, or when he was on his mule. And again, Ghazali, he said to him, he said, this is all my knowledge. I've acquired all these papers over many, many years. And then the man said to him, what type of knowledge is it if I can steal it away from you? So what type of knowledge is that if I can actually steal it away from you? It's just a statement that Ghazali, he said. And I didn't mention this previously, but what Ghazali said in his autobiography, which is like an advice as well, he says, I know that it was God who made that man speak. And he did so he could teach me a lesson. So Ghazali, he said, I know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made him speak. And I know that he did that so he could no doubt teach me a lesson. Now, in terms of Imam al-Ghazali, and we're going to cover as much as we can within the time that we have. But Imam al-Ghazali, as we said, he doubted the knowledge in terms of the empirical, in terms of the five senses. When he was going through this stage, he even doubted reason, first principles. Then he says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he cast a light upon my heart, and so on and so forth, and he experienced something. So he is saying that this is a science, right? Essentially. This is very important because it's going to take us into our next phase. It's a very, very good segue. So Ghazali is essentially saying that this thing that I experienced is real. So Ghazali, he divides knowledge into four types. Ghazali, he divides knowledge into four types. This is essential that you know this about Ghazali. What I've done, I've picked the main things and the most important things that I possibly can to give them to you so that you would at least know about Ghazali. He divides knowledge into four types. First and foremost, for the first category is the knowledge of the philosophers. So he has the knowledge of the philosophers, which is number one. Knowledge of the philosophers means that it is purely rational. So just completely rational. It's based on logic, it's based on rationale, and that's A. So I'll take you through the categories and I'll show you what Imam al-Ghazali did. So essentially he says it's based on rationale. The second type of knowledge that he classifies, or the second group, he talks about the knowledge of the theologians. The knowledge of the theologians. So the knowledge of the theologians, which is the scholars who have grasped theology. So they understand theology. He says it's a mixture between rationale and revealed text. So rationale and revealed text. So again, I'll say this one more time. Ghazali is dividing knowledge into four types. The first type is philosophy, which is purely rationale. The second type is theology, or the theologians, the knowledge of the theologians, which is rationale plus revealed text from Allah Ta'ala. The third one is the esoterists, or basically the Batinites. So these Batinites, what they would be classified today, or if you like, the materialists, or the naturalists, or the natural philosopher. Nowadays you would call them possibly a scientist. It's completely, essentially an outward thing. So what he's saying, essentially, it's got nothing to do with the rationale. It's got everything to do with something that is completely physical, and like such as what a scientist does. So he takes measurements, he does particular things. So the materialist, a naturalist, or a natural philosopher, or what they would call a scientist nowadays. So he's got them in that category. So you see now those three categories so far: philosophy, or the philosophers, purely rational; the theologians, rational plus divine texts; and then you have the esotericist, which is again the scientists. And then the last one he classifies is the knowledge of the Sufis. So the knowledge of the Sufis. So what Ghazali does, and this is absolutely profound, he masters the three first forms of knowledge. He absolutely masters the field of philosophy, he masters the field of theology, and he masters the field of science, if you like, or materialist, or a naturalist. He masters basically every field, and he reaches the logical conclusions that the science, each of those fields, each of those three fields aims to produce. You see, Ghazali essentially says that this is the problem with sectarianism. He says that the problem with sectarianism is that they don't reach logical conclusions. Let me give you an example. If there is a particular science, ultimately at the end of the day, that science, there's a dead end. Essentially, there may be a particular field where you reach a dead end. So he says sectarianism, sometimes with the argument with sectarianism is it's very superficial, because most people don't reach the dead end. They don't reach the logical conclusions of where they're going. So because they don't reach the logical conclusions of where they're going and things remain superficial, that's why there are so many problems. So he essentially blames sectarianism on people's lack of reaching those logical conclusions or dead ends about a particular field. So he essentially is saying that people are trapped because of their inability to exhaust their own thoughts. So essentially Ghazali is saying they don't reach their logical conclusions, their dead ends, and that's why we have sectarianism. So those three fields, in terms of philosophy, theology, and the science aspect, he basically reaches dead ends. Now we have to understand one thing, and this is very, very critical. In 1734, the first encyclopedia ever written was 3 volumes. Now the reason I say that is for the following. If in 1734, the encyclopedia consisted of only 3 volumes, the reason I say this is because what I'm about to say is going to sound almost very far-fetched, but it's actually possible. Ghazali actually in his time knew everything. Everything that was to be known in his time was known by Ghazali. And that's actually possible. If the first encyclopedia consisted of only 3 volumes, if it only consisted of 3 volumes, and when we talk about encyclopedias, they basically state everything that can be known. What the scholars have said is that Ghazali at the time knew everything that was to be known. And he wrote encyclopedias. He wrote, as we said, by the time that he passed away, and he was only 55 years of age, he'd written 200 books. And some of those books were volumes. He was an encyclopedia. Again, we said that Al-Mudir consisted of 40 books. So he had an encyclopedic mind. And we're going to get into a bit about other books that he wrote, which were phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. Some scholars, they even said about Ghazali that at the core, Imam al-Ghazali was an usuli. He was an usuli. He was about usul al-fiqh. Some ulama have said, and they said this is what some of the Western scholars, the Western academics have said at the core he was an usuli scholar. Al-Mustasfa, which is a book he based on usul al-fiqh, and I'll come to explain that a bit more. Some scholars said that if they were stuck on an island, other than the Quran and the Hadith, what other book would they have? And some scholars have said they will have that book, Al-Mustasfa. We'll explain what that book is in a second. But the reality is what Ghazali is saying, that people are trapped by their inability to exhaust their own thoughts. Hence, they don't reach logical conclusions, right? Ghazali knew pretty much all that there was to be known at that time. and that is certainly possible. So he dismantles each of those three categories. He dismantles philosophy. He dismantles what the theologians believe. He dismantles the Batinites or the Batiniyya, where basically, or the modern day scientists you would call it. But then what happens, he said the only group that I couldn't dismantle, which is group number 4. He said the only group that I could not dismantle was the group of the Sufis. I could not dismantle the arguments. And this is what he says. He says, I couldn't dismantle the arguments. He said because the arguments were not based on rationale. It wasn't rational. These people, the arguments were not based on rationale. How can I dismantle and deconstruct something that is not based on rationale? And so it's not based on that very thing which I want to use as my tool to deconstruct the thing. So essentially what he says, I have all the rational tools to fight all the other groups, but I don't have the rational tools to fight this one because it wasn't based on rationale. He says, I couldn't dismantle it. So he says that the Sufis were arguing that this, if you like, this group of Tasawwuf was in effect a science, but it wasn't a science in the normal way that you would understand that was based on rationale, but rather it was a science of the self. So they were arguing Ghazali is saying these people are arguing that this is a science of the self, and basically the whole concept of Tasawwuf is to dismantle the self. Ghazali is saying I had no tools by which I could dismantle this group or deconstruct what they were saying to me because it wasn't based on anything rational. So what happens, the Sufis are arguing and they're saying, or putting forth as an argument, that this science which dismantles oneself is actually, it allows one to perceive the reality of the self. And essentially what they're saying is, and this is the argument, that because this is a science, it can be replicated. It can be replicated. And Ghazali essentially saying is that this was the argument, that these people, and for over historically the men and women have been arguing that if you do these things under these conditions, it will lead you to the same journey as everyone else has taken. Look what they're arguing. They're saying it's a science, right? But they're saying it's a different kind of science, not one that's based on rationale. So they're saying and arguing, if you do this, based on these conditions, you will be taken to a journey as everyone else has undertaken, and it will lead you to the same certainty. This is very important. And it will lead you to the same certainty that has arisen in the previous peoples. So they're almost saying that this is a science because this can be falsified. Remember Karl Popper, we mentioned earlier, Karl Popper was saying that it's not science if you can't disprove it. Karl Popper was saying it's not science if you can't disprove it. But their argument, they're saying, well, if you do this based on these conditions, you will attain that yaqeen that every single person that walked that path had. And that's essentially what Ghazali is saying. He's saying that yaqeen was acquired when I put this path into fruition. So it's a testable science. And that's why he couldn't deconstruct or dismantle that very science. And it's very rational. In that argument in and of itself is very rational. Even though it's not based on rationale, but the argument is rational. So then Ghazali basically says, here's the map, you need a guide, right? First and foremost, you need a guide. And it can be very well argued whether or not Al-Ghazali had a guide. All right, he was, again, we know what Ghazali was. And we know Abu Ali, again, his teacher that taught him Tasawwuf when he was very young. But he states that you need a guide. So here's the map. You need a guide, okay? And this is what you need for your journey. So here's the map. These are the conditions. You need a guide. Here's what you need for the journey. But then he says, but then you must set out on that journey. He said you actually have to take the journey. It's not just a matter of words, right? He's saying here's the map, here's the guide, here's what you need for the journey, but then you actually have to take the journey. You have to take the journey. He said, I can't help you after that. Right? He said, I can't help you after that. Now what's interesting is, why do they call him Hujjatul Islam? Ghazali is saying, I took that path. I undertook that journey. I am the proof of Islam. I found the yaqeen. What I found and what I saw wasn't make-believe. What I perceived And the experience that I had wasn't just a matter of telltale stories. It wasn't just simply fiction. And that's part of the reason of why they called him Hujjatul Islam. Why did they call him Hujjatul Islam? I am proof. I am the living proof. And not anybody can just get that title, Hujjatul Islam. Hujjatul Islam as a title, not any person can just get that title. So he's saying to them, essentially, this is a real place. I am the proof of it. And that's why they call him Hujjatul Islam. Did anybody know that? Put your hand up if you knew that. You knew that already? There you go. So that's what he's essentially saying. I am the proof of Islam. And we see, for example, what Ghazali, he says in a lot of his texts, that essentially he found yes, feelings of ecstasy. He found feelings that overwhelmed him, experiences and presences that overwhelmed him. And again, you know, that word wajada, which also means find, but it also means to find or enter into an ecstatic state. So into a state that is indescribable. And so this is very important, because again, this is, if you were to look at Ghazali's life, these now 10 or 20 minutes that we've discussed in terms of those 4 aspects of knowledge, and Ghazali is saying I was essentially unable to dismantle that the knowledge of tasawwuf, because essentially they were arguing it's a science, it's repeatable, and you can test it, but you have to take the journey. And it's phenomenal in that regard. So we move on in terms of Imam al-Ghazali, that many knew Imam al-Ghazali for many different things, and for many different books. Even before he went on his great journey of 10 to 11 years, they knew him for many books. Now that book that he wrote historically, some of the scholars that, even though he was known for Ihya, which is the revival, which we've discussed, and it's about really internalizing the formalities of the disciplines. So internalizing the salat, internalizing Ramadan, internalizing all these aspects of our faith that are mandatory. And he was known for al-ihya. But many people and many historians and many ulama have said that the single most important book historically was Al-Mustasfa, and it was an usul book that he wrote. And he added things to usul nobody had previously done. And it is said that Imam al-Haramain or al-Juwayni had started some of those aspects but never finished. And al-Ghazali that actually finished what his scholar, what his teacher had started. So essentially he added things that were not initially there. He also wrote books on moral ethics called Mizan al-Amal. So Mizan al-Amal is another book that he wrote, again, on moral philosophy. He wrote about politics, he wrote about morality, he wrote about deconstructing the philosophers, he wrote about the aims and objectives, he wrote about the sciences of Islam. And we are just talking a very little of what Ghazali wrote about. But these are some of the things that have been written and even translated. And a lot of the translators on Ghazali's text have not even been by Muslim translators, but rather they've been by academics, Western academics translating his books. A lot of his books outside Ihya have been translated also by Western academics, which is another thing really to take notice of. But one thing about Ihya which I really wanted to share with you is this. And he gives an example. So Ghazali, he says medicines are composed of ingredients. And I'm just going to give you one example. So it's an example of how to internalize something, right? It's an example of how to really come alive with a particular thing. So he says that medicines entail ingredients of many kinds and compound medicines. So they're weighted, and there's a certain amount that you involve, and there's a different secret composition of those medicines that come together. And so he says that similarly, that worship. Now he says, so medicine, you mix this with that, you mix that with this, secret compound, certain weights for this, certain weights for that, you bring them together, you treat a medical ailment or physical ailment, right? So then he says, in a like way, when it comes to ibadah, right? So when it comes to formal worship, so formal worship, now I am worshipping Allah in a formal way. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has obligated me to pray. That's formal worship. I have to come and stand before Allah wa ta'ala. He says, in a like way, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has brought certain compounds together. Certain things He's compounded together. So He said, and he gives an example, and he said they're in different kinds and they're in different amounts. And he says, for example, your ruku' is 1, your sujood is 2. He said these are secrets, but there's secrets that have come together that you can't possibly know the reality of. But these are compound. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has compounded these acts. Ruku' being 1, only ruku' 1, and you make 2 sajdas. So you make 2 of them. This is a secret compound that has come together. And yet you have half the ibadah in the fajr as opposed to that of the night. So you get 2 in the morning, you get 4 at night. So again, certain weights and certain, again, the weight of the morning is different to the weight of the night. It's double. So he said these secret things, in reality, there's a mystery. There's a mystery behind these things. And he said if a person fancies that they happened accidentally, so if you just believe and conjure in your mind that they're an accident and they're not from a divine mystery which fixed them that way by that property, he said you are a very foolish individual. You are a very foolish individual. And this is what Ghazali is trying to say, is these are fixed, and there may be a mystery, a secret, and there certainly is to them. And said if you understand anything else to the contrary, then you're mistaken. You're a fool. He's calling the person a fool. So just like a person, things come together to treat his physical ailment. Likewise, the salat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has brought things together in an exact way, in a prescribed way, but to treat the illness of your heart. To treat the illness of your heart. And again, when I said to you before, Ghazali's depiction of the ruh is like a reservoir. He pictures it like a reservoir. Pollutants because of the 5 senses. And likewise, in his Ihya, what he's essentially saying is that this prayer, which needs to be internalized, is actually a remedy for your ruh and a remedy for the disease that basically takes control within. And he said it's a medicine of the diseases of the hearts, which there is no doubt about. So what I want to get on in our time is, and we haven't spoke about. So we've looked at Ghazali's some aspects, and I'll say some aspects, because again, like we said at the beginning, there is no one expert in the world. There is no master of Ghazali's life. There is no master of Ghazali's life, given that his legacy was so complex, and given that there was so much that he wrote about. It's very, very difficult for there to be one master, and that's what scholars have articulated and said very, very clearly. But the scholars, what they deem Imam al-Ghazali, they deem him the mujaddid of his century. They deem him the mujaddid of the fifth century. That's what they deem him as. Now the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he said, and I'm going to give you three hadith, where the Prophet alayhi salatu says in the first, he says, there will always be in my nation a group who will safeguard the truth until the resurrection comes. So there is always going to be a group. So that was narrated in Hakim al-Mustadrak. There is always going to be a group amongst my ummah who will safeguard this deen. There will always be a group who will safeguard that deen. And just on that note, actually reminds me, the person, you know, we have this concept of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. The one who actually invented that word Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah was actually Imam Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari himself. Just thought I'd mention that. The second hadith that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned is, he said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will send for this ummah at the head of every 100 years or every century a person who shall revive their religion for them. So the Prophet ﷺ is saying at the head of every 100 years Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will send for this ummah someone to revive the what? Someone to revive the religion. And that individual is called a mujaddid. Okay, he does tajdeed. He is a renewer. We're going to find out, well, what are the conditions? What makes you a mujaddid? What makes you a mujaddid? And if you know, how are you classified a mujaddid? What are the conditions? What's the classification? Is it compulsory to adhere to the books of a mujaddid? So we'll find out as we move along. The last one is the Prophet ﷺ said, Al-ulama warathatul anbiya. The scholars are the inheritors of the Prophet. So that one we know. That one we all know, but the other ones you may or may not have heard before, but the Prophet said that Allah will send someone who revives his deen at the head of every 100 years. Now, someone who is a mujaddid is not somebody who wins a battle. It's not somebody who wins a battle, he engaged in a battle and he won. It's not somebody who writes a book. It's not somebody who wrote a book and said, Khalas, I'm a mujaddid. That doesn't make you a mujaddid. Someone who writes even many books is not classified in reality as a mujaddid. There are certain conditions that are applicable, and just simply writing a few things or becoming renowned for a few things maybe here or there is not enough. It's not enough. It has to be more specific. And so the scholars, they know how to look at these conditions. And basically what the scholars have said, and Mufti Taqi Uthmani, again, I'm going to add a little bit of his opinions in here, and Imam al-Nawawi's as well, about some of the conditions that they put down of what actually deems a mujaddid. But essentially, somebody who revives the religion is somebody who restores the original beliefs and practices. Somebody who restores the original beliefs and practices after they have been changed, distorted, or forgotten. Very important. So somebody who restores the original beliefs and practices after they may have been distorted, forgotten, or in some way they have been altered. And so it certainly is the case, given what the hadith indicates. The hadith does indicate that some circles from the ummah may forget original teachings. They may forget that, or some foreign teachings may creep into the deen, and that may very well be the case. But if that's the case and that happens, that will not reach universal acceptance. So if we said that somebody brought about a foreign thing into the faith, into the religion, a concept, say for example, a concept, will that reach universal acceptance? We say no, it will not reach universal acceptance. It will not reach universal acceptance. But what we say is that person or that thing may attract a lot of people, and it may attract a lot of attention, and that may very well be the case, and a person may succeed. And if that person succeeds, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will do, He will send the mujaddid, and the mujaddid, what will happen in essence, he will remove that which is foreign, or that which has been forgotten, or that which has definitely been altered. Now a mujaddid, what he does, it's a holistic thing. So it's politically, ethically, spiritually, intellectually. In every facet he is acting and operating. It's not just in one facet. Basically he brings back the primal wholeness. What he's doing, he brings back the primal wholeness and mutuality that existed in the souls of the companions and the Prophet ﷺ, who in their time, they didn't have the individual sciences like theology or philosophy or moral ethics. They didn't have that. All they had at that time was Deen. That's what it was known as. That was just simply Deen. So what this person does, he brings back that primal wholeness in every facet. That primal wholeness and mutuality that existed in the Sahaba and existed in the Prophet ﷺ. So he shows a coherence and understanding of all parts of the religion, showing the immense simplicity of adhering to the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And that is the objective, the adherence to that Sunnah. So that primal wholeness, it all must align with the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And that's the particularly what Taqi Uthmani has mentioned in terms of what he has said. And so when we say a mujaddid in terms of someone who revives and restores, that's in essence what we are saying. So sometimes people, they do use that word for certain people, but maybe that person hasn't met the condition. And sometimes people would use that word loosely, and it won't apply to that individual because maybe of certain factors, or they're neglected in certain factors. In saying that also, a mujaddid, basically, it's not a formal position in a way like a prophet is a formal position. Taqi Uthmani is saying that a mujaddid, as opposed to a prophet, they're different things. A prophet and a messenger are formal positions. They're formal roles. Whereas a mujaddid is not technically a formal role. It's not a formal role, but it's defined by what he does and what and his writings in terms of what he was able to impart and give humanity. And we see that in Ghazali. So the scholars agree that the mujaddid of the 5th century was Imam al-Ghazali, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. They agree, and they're in agreement. And the reality is that, as we said at the beginning, that there is almost unanimity. There is almost a consensus that Islamic civilization has not produced a more intellectual and brilliant man than Ghazali. There's almost unanimity in that regard. Almost unanimity. that the basis for a mujaddid is clear, and his role is really defined in terms of whether or not he's a mujaddid. He doesn't say, I am a mujaddid. So again, a person, he doesn't become a self-claimant mujaddid. And if we said that the person is deemed a mujaddid, doesn't actually make it incumbent upon a person to follow or not follow, or adhere or not adhere. And basically the essential reality is this, that prophets are the main revivers of this religion. And this is what you need to understand. Prophets are the main ones who revive this religion. When we talk about a mujaddid, it's a mini revival. But the prophets, it's a main revival in a sense. But again, as we said, the mujaddid is not a formal role. It's nowhere in comparison to what a prophet, to the formal role of a prophet. And that's a very important distinction to be made. I'll leave it at that. We'll have a break, inshallah. I hope everybody's taken notes. But again, it's like we said at the very, very start. Let's not make it just about note taking, but something we really take with us. I think this is a fantastic initiative that the Dar has initiated and has actually run, and I do believe that if you are continuing, and you should continue to the very end and take it as seriously as you possibly can, you will see an immense amount of benefit. So when you hear from a lot of people and you hear a lot of information and you take your notes and you go over your notes and you revise your notes. Revise your notes to try and commit certain things to memory. It is indeed and will be indeed a very important thing for you, and a beneficial thing for you now, in the future, with your children, but spiritually as well. So it's, for a person to come in and give up their time and make those sacrifices, they're going to benefit. So there's going definitely to be a benefit. So you've made the sacrifice, you've come out and you're listening to all the speakers speak. So there definitely, bi'idhnillahi tabaraka wa ta'ala, there will be a lot of benefit. And the benefit extends not only to you, but you may have family at home, children at home. There will also be benefit to them as well. So the benefit, Allah's rahmah and Allah's bounties cannot be restricted. Cannot be restricted. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ultimately doesn't need you or I. We're not needed. If we worshipped Allah for an eternity of days, it would not increase Allah. And if we neglected worship for an eternity of days, it would not decrease Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ghani. He is ghani. He is not in need of His creation. We add nothing to Allah that isn't already there. And we take nothing from Allah. Even if everybody were to ask, you imagine billions and billions and billions and billions of people who have lived, walked on this earth and left, that if every single one of them were to ask what he wanted from Allah, can you imagine what you could ask for? 50 galaxies, 200 universes. And you imagine that the mind can just think, it can think, and Allah were to give each and every one of you what you wanted, then that would not reduce from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's kingdom. It wouldn't reduce. Whatever you asked for, it would not reduce Allah. So you see, it is about seeking that reality. It is about seeking that truth. And it is about, again, and we tie it back into Ghazali. I incorporate a lot of Ghazali into a lot of theology that I teach. And when I teach theology class, I bring a lot of Ghazali into that teaching, because there's a lot of things that he says that capture the mind, and I can't help but bring some of those concepts into the class. And even the students that used to listen to Ghazali speak about Allah, and he had thousands and thousands of students. When he was giving lectures in Iraq or in Baghdad, and he would have thousands of students, and they weren't just his students, but just people, many he didn't know, and he would absolutely dazzle them. This is before he went on his journey. He would dazzle his audience, absolutely dazzle his audience. But it's again that information, it's that knowledge that you're imparting, it's that knowledge that you're giving to the people, that you're explaining, that they become dazzled. Again, al-ulama warathatul anbiya, that the scholars are the inheritors of the prophets. So it's something that you're giving them that has come down from person to person to person to person, from sheikh to student and sheikh to student, and so on and so forth. And so it's that chain that affects, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who bestows the light on the heart. So he sought, and he is, I don't think anyone can run a theology class without mentioning Ghazali. And some of the guys that I know personally, I mean, how important is Ghazali in some of the classes that we run? He's essential in some of the things that we have, and he resolves many issues. You know, many issues that we talk about, and I'll just give you an example. You know, does man possess any power? Do you have any power? And if I could just explain this, you know, if I want to lift up this, you know, this bottle of water, do I actually have power over it? Do I actually have power over it? Or did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala create basically the movement in my arm and all that movement for me to latch onto that and for it to extend, to rise up? Do I actually have the power? Now, if you have independent power, which is independent of Allah, then you're a creator. You are a creator. So you can't have independent power of Allah wa ta'ala. So do you have then dependent power? So is it a type of dependent power then that you have? What type of power is it? That is it power that can actually do? So are you an actual doer now? This still doesn't resolve the problem, right? And Allah, we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one in His actions, one in His essence, and one in His attributes. So He is ahad fi dhatihi, ahad fi sifatihi, wa ahad fi af'alihi. He is one in His essence, one in His attributes, and one in His actions. So if He's one in His actions, in terms of, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only creator, there is no partner. And so who do you have power or do you not have power? You know, some went to an extreme that said, yeah, man has all the power. The Qadariyah, again, some of them said they went to an extreme. They said, oh, we have all the power and we don't even need any help from Allah wa ta'ala. We have all the power. And then some went to the extent that said, no, we have no power at all. We have absolutely no power. That in fact, we're forced to do something. So if we commit an act of sin, we're forced by Allah. And then Ghazali, he resolves the issue. Ghazali, he comes in and he says, no, if mankind, he said, it's you can't just assume, right? You can't just think that God is going to come and say, you are responsible, and yet you have no power over your actions. So there is a form of power, but what type of power? Well, it's a type of non-doing power. It's non-doing power. Or inert, it's inert power. Inert, but there is power there. But he resolves it, again, I'm giving you a very brief breakdown. I'm not going to go into the entirety of that concept, but to say that Allah's power is the doing power. It's the active power, and yours is the inert power. So it's the inactive power. Does that make sense? But in a sense, you still have it, but it's inactive. Whereas Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is active and yours isn't. So in essence, if someone says, well, what are we judged for? And what are we brought to account for? Well, the reality is what you're brought to account for is your intentions. And you're veering towards a thing and you're receiving the act. So I intend and I receive, but Allah creates. So I intend that I want to throw a ball or a rock at that window. I don't, but I intend that I want to do that. And I have a firm resolve. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gives me what I want. He gives me what I want. And so the act of me picking up that rock, whatever the case is, and throwing and the breaking of the window, that's absolutely the case that it wasn't me who created the breaking act of the window, but I am actually brought to account because I intended the act and I received what I wanted. I received what I wanted, which is a very important distinction. So Ghazali, when he was going, you can't possibly run a full, in-depth, detailed analysis of theology without mentioning Ghazali. And I'll just give you another example. If I said to you that I will, and some of the guys know what we're going to do, but if I said to you that here is a tissue, and if I were to get a lighter and burn that tissue, did the actual fire burn the tissue? Now Ghazali would say, can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep giving you life if you are decapitated? If you lose your head, can Allah still give you life? Yes. Yes, He can. Can He? Or can't He? Who says no? Put your hand up. Of course He can. Allah can still give life even if you've lost your head. Can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala create the feeling of fulfillment if you haven't eaten? Yes. Can Allah create the feeling of being quenched of your thirst if you haven't drunk any water? Yes. Okay, so He said in essence, things don't have a nature. Fire doesn't burn. He said fire doesn't burn. So when you see fire come next to this tissue, He said, and the combustion and the smoke happens, Allah is creating that effect. All you're seeing is one thing with the other, but one thing was not caused by the other. So you're just seeing two things together. You assume it's caused by it, but it's not. So he said things don't have a nature. This is Allah's direct control of producing the act of combustion and burning and smoke in the tissue, and not the actual fire. Right? That's what he's saying. Now, Kant, who was also a philosopher, he borrowed that from Ghazali, and he also held a similar concept to Ghazali, who believed that Kant was, again, he had many concepts that obviously don't align to Islam, but just in that particular regard, he also held that same concept as Ghazali in terms of causes and effect. And in terms of cause and effect. So Ghazali, you can't possibly have a class of theology, an in-depth one, without mentioning a man who was known as one of the greats in the Ash'ari field or school of theology. It's not possible. So he is indeed one of the great theologians, and what he would dazzle. He would absolutely dazzle his audience, and they would listen to him, and they would be overtaken. And that's the reality, because when you inform people about Allah and they have that knowledge, again, what Ghazali is saying and what I've been reading to you in the Arabic, well, what do you do with that knowledge? How do you internalize that knowledge? Because I could give you proofs all day about the existence of God, and you may come to believe in that something exists and that God exists. But if you surround yourself in a wrong environment, or you give yourself a life devoid of actions, the doubt will come back. So yaqeen is in the experience. Ghazali does make a point which is absolutely spot on. There is a massive element of dhawq, of taste, of experiencing God, of being in that experience, of being in that closeness. And that's why he says, I could not dismantle the knowledge of tasawwuf. I couldn't dismantle it, because these people were not speaking to me based on rationale. They were speaking to me in a science which was completely different. It was a style of tajruba. It was a science of actually going on a journey and being part of that journey. So he is indeed going to be a person even today. Society has big problems today, and part and parcel of how we deal with the contemporary issues we have, we do need the Ghazali. Montgomery Watt, when I said at the very beginning, when he said Ghazali is very pertinent and important in our time because there are human constants that don't change. Absolutely, there are human constants that don't change. Now, Ghazali wrote a whole book and many books on character, but in one of the books that he wrote on character, he wrote about how a person changes. Because, and I often come across this, and I mentioned it the other day, that people, when they come to marry, or you see it all the time, or you've probably said it sometimes in your life, you've said, I can't change. Don't you know how I am? I can't change. This is how I'm supposed to be. Or in marriage, before they get married, the husband or the wife might say to their opposite, they might say, well, you have to accept me how I am. You have to be careful. You have to not do this, or you have to not do that. You have to not push my buttons here. You have to not push my buttons there. But that's completely counterproductive and counterintuitive to what the Prophet ﷺ came for, which is إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمُ الْأَخْلَاقِ. I came to change you, to create that moral framework, the best moral framework for you by which to act, to complete your perfect character, your moral conduct. So when a person, he says, I can't change, you actually resigned, right? You've almost like signed something saying, I've resigned from life, I've resigned from change, I can't change anymore. This is completely counter to the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, who came to change you. Completely counter to the sunnah of the Prophet, who says, I came to change you. And Ghazali, what Ghazali does, he writes books and books about change. And he gives some examples. And you know what he says? And this is, the way that he looks at it is really amazing. It's amazing. And we need to pay attention to how he says that change can come about. So one example that he gives, he says that when you visit people, so when you visit other people, and you go in and you visit in other people, he said you should make that as part of your practice of change. Because what happens, he said that a brother mirrors another brother. So a Muslim is a mirror to another. So he says when you go and visit people and you see something, you may see something that you dislike in him. But on some level, you've seen something you dislike, but on some level, you know in your consciousness that you have that same thing, or you have part of what he has. So when you can identify that thing in somebody else, you start to identify that in yourself. And through the process of introspection, it causes change. And you start to say, I don't want to be like that. And so what he's saying is that a person who wants to undertake change, and again, this is about Ghazali's Ihya. If you look at his Ihya, it is about total reformation, total transformation, self-reformation. And so Ghazali is saying that change will come about, if the more you engage in visiting people, the more you engage in maybe, when you visit people who may need help, people who may be, wandering away from the way that they should be going. And so you visit maybe the young men or women who visit maybe the women, and in that regard they see something and it affects them. It really, really affects them. And they say, I will not be like that. I will not be like that. I'm not going to imitate that. So that's one way. Another way that Ghazali was saying that change happens is when a person, maybe he has a friend. Maybe there is a friend who can advise him, and a trusted friend. Not a friend who points the finger. Not a friend who every time you say, why did you do that? He points the finger back and says, yeah, but you did A, B, C, D. He's not talking about that type of friend, but a guide, a master, right? Somebody, maybe a sheikh who understands this discipline, who knows this discipline. So when he sees something in you, he says, look, this is a thing in you, and I've identified this thing in you. And so when you take somebody like that who can say, I've identified this particular thing in you. Now, if there's no such guide or there's no such master who understands that discipline, then even a friend, even on some level a friend who can say that, look, this is a particular thing which I've identified, that, look, I think you would need to change. But it should be somebody close, somebody who's trusted, somebody who has no vested interest, somebody who's not motives it is to hurt you or insult you, but somebody who's really close, who you know can be in that space. And Ghazali says that change can come about. Change can absolutely come about. And if you look at in his Ihya or his books that he wrote, he says that the way that change comes about is through a constant and consistent practice. So he says, if you want to take on a new quality and you wanted to take on a new attribute, the way that you take on that new attribute, and he gives an example, he says, let's say there's a person who's stingy. So there's a person who's tight with money. So what happens to that person is, Ghazali says that what he should do is every day he should give something to the poor. Every day he should contribute, even though it feels like he's chopping off his hand, because he's tight, he's stingy. He's stingy. So what he does is very hard for him to even give, maybe even a little bit a day. So what happens is, Ghazali is saying, no, give. Even though you might find it very, very difficult, but give every day until you've given for such a long time, where that act of giving becomes habitual. So what he says is, you have to copy. So he says, you're stingy, look at a person who you can copy. If you can't imitate the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ through his sunnah, because he's not like a person who's in front of you, but even though the sunnah is, then look at somebody who's maybe as a friend or a sheikh or whatever, and just copy his actions every day. Copy his actions. And the more you copy and the more you give and the more you practice, and it becomes habitual. So you copy and you persist. He said what will happen eventually, that particular trait will become part of your traits. He says like a calligrapher, if he wants to become a calligrapher, the way that he does it is it's repetition. And it's constant repetition until he becomes good at it. So likewise with the act of patience or removing anger. So Ghazali makes things very clear in terms of change at a level which is a very deep level. And it's about reforming. It's about reformation. It's about self-reformation. It's not just a book where he discusses things very shallow. They're academic books that are written, but it is something that this world needs, contemporary times need. And it's something that definitely his lens we need to look through in order to provide a remedy to the things that we are going through today. So as we said, Ghazali, and I'll just make a quick mention of this maybe for those who weren't here, but the greatest shirk that Ghazali wanted to deconstruct was the shirk of the ego, the idol of the mind. That's what he wanted to really dismantle and deconstruct. So the idol of the self. And so in that regard, he will always be relevant. He will always be contemporary. He will, in that way, because again, some constants, the human condition and the want doesn't change. That condition. And so this is something that we'll always look towards to. Imam al-Nawawi, he said, if all the books, and this is a famous saying, if all the books of Islam were lost, the ihya would suffice them. Imam al-Nawawi said, if all the books of Islam were lost, the ihya would suffice them. It would suffice them. So, without further ado, I wanted to pick something with you. I wanted to discuss this particular topic with you. Again, I've selected certain things that I wanted to really bring out today. So you could go away with. Now, if the Quran speaks about something, about the existence of something, I'm going to do an analysis now, a little bit of analysis on the tahafut, okay, which is the incoherence of the philosophers. Now, first and foremost, my advice is for you not to read that book, because if you read that book without having studied theology, you're going to become somewhat confused. You're not going to know where he's coming from, and particularly if you don't know the Arabic, so you don't know what is meant by what he's saying. But essentially, I'm just going to do a little bit of a background to at-tahafut, to the incoherence. If the Quran speaks of the existence of something, and this is what in essence is saying, what is the relationship to reason? So the Quran might speak of a particular thing, which is a revealed text. What's the relationship to reason, to your rationale, to your logical proofs? What is the connection? Now, can reason be correct and the text incorrect? Okay, just hold that question for a second, but you know the answer obviously. Or can reason be incorrect? Can reason be incorrect and text be correct regardless of whether you understand it or not? Would you agree with that? So reason can be incorrect, but text will always be correct regardless of whether you understand it or not. Can that be the case? Yes. Okay. So Ghazali takes issue with the philosophers. The first book that he wrote was Maqasid. He wrote a book, the aims and purposes of the philosophers, which wasn't to dismantle their arguments, but the other book that he wrote after was Tahafut, which was to completely destroy their arguments. The book is wholly destructive. The premise of it is destructive, not constructive. He wasn't looking to do construction of anything. He was looking to destroy the arguments of the philosophers. And what he essentially says is, Imam al-Ghazali, he doesn't say the philosophers are wrong. He doesn't say, sorry, that philosophy is wrong. He says, but the philosophers they're wrong because they're being unreasonable. So in essence, in this book, he's not saying philosophy is wrong. He's not saying that. What he's saying is that on this particular occasion, or on these particular subjects, they're being unreasonable. They're absolutely being unreasonable. So this is not somebody, in essence, like Imam al-Ghazali, who's anti-philosophy. He's not anti-philosophy, and he's not an anti-rationalist. He's not. But what he's in effect saying is that these philosophers are being unreasonable on these particular grounds. And so he accuses, actually what he does in the book, he accuses philosophers with disbelief on 3 accounts. He says these philosophers are disbelievers on 3 accounts. These are the 3 accounts that he gives. A quarter of the book of Tahafut is dedicated to disproving that the world is eternal. A quarter of the book is dedicated to proving that this world, this universe is not eternal. Now, if we look in this regard, Avicenna or Ibn Sina and some other ones like Averroes, Ibn Rushd and others, and there are definitely concepts that existed from the philosophers, they believe that matter is an eternal thing, and that God simply reforms or reshapes and so on and so forth. Ghazali had, because they were trying to solve a problem philosophically, But Ghazali is saying, but you fundamentally contravene principles, Islamic principles, in order for you to hold that belief. And it's very, very detailed in how he destroys and deconstructs their arguments. But he dedicates a quarter of the book. The second thing that Ghazali accuses them of disbelief, he says to them that they deny, see, al-juz'iyat, right? Al-juz'iyat is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to know each and everything absolutely and specifically and so on and so forth, right? So the philosophers would say God is simple, so he knows things generally, not specifically. Ghazali is saying no, God knows things specifically. So some of the Avicenna would say, we don't dispute that God knows things specifically, but he knows them in a universal way. What Avicenna was essentially saying, he's saying that there is knowledge that is created knowledge, and you can't have that created knowledge be known by God when he's outside of time. So what Avicenna was saying was that he knows al-juz'iyat, things specifically, but in a universal way. Ghazali said no. He said, I understand your problem. I understand your problem in what you're trying to say in created knowledge. And that's why you're saying he knows it universally. I understand your problem, but your problem is incorrect, or your philosophy or your way of thinking is incorrect, because these are the problems that ensue from having that belief, A, B, C, D. And he uses Avicenna's own philosophy against him to disprove of what they're saying. And that's what Ghazali would do. He would say, take the proof of the one that you're arguing against, pick a point in that proof that he can't do without, twist that point around for him, and then use it against him. So that's what he would say. Take his argument, pick a point, and use that point against him. So in essence, what he's saying is that you create the platform from which you argue. In essence, that's what he's saying. So he accused them that you can't say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't know the juz'iyat. And he dedicated a big amount for that book. Again, Aristotle and Plato, they held that he doesn't. And Ghazali absolutely disagreed. But some held on to that. So when they done the tahafut, later on, what would come about from Ibn Rushd? He would write the rebuttal to Ghazali. He wrote the rebuttal to Ghazali. Ghazali, he deconstructed Aristotelianism. He deconstructed those points that didn't align. But then his work subsequently, there was a rad to Ghazali. There was a rad to Ghazali. I've read that, but Ghazali is standing on firm ground. Even though, again, we have the highest respect for all our scholars, but Ghazali is definitely standing on firm ground. Absolutely. So the third thing that he accuses the philosophers of having acquired the state of disbelief is the fact that they deny the bodily resurrection on the Day of Judgment. They deny the bodily resurrection on the Day of Judgment. That's what they deny. So on three accounts, on the eternity of this universe, and mind you, he does believe that time and space began. He does go into depth in that, and that's a very important thing, because when scientists argue about time and space and what's the Islamic concept, well, that is the Islamic concept, and comes back to Ghazali. Ghazali says that time is a created thing. Time is a created thing, and the space is a created thing. So time and space are created things. That is Al-Ghazali's view, and that's the view that I definitely cling to. So Ghazali is not a person who's basically saying that in these arguments, and he's accusing them of these things. And when the scholars and the academics look at Ghazali's tahafut, they don't say to him, you are a lunatic. They don't say that. They don't say that you're a person who's making just unsystematic statements. They look at his arguments as highly intellectual, systematic arguments, logical arguments. They might not agree with him, but they hold his arguments in a very, very high regard. You know, sometimes when a person can cling to a position, but at some point you say that that person has sort of become, very sort of maybe personal in a sense, right? Personal, and you start to sort of attribute them with maybe they're lunatic, maybe they're insane, maybe they're this or that, or maybe they're not academic, whatever the case may be. No Western academic, no Muslim academic ever said about the tahafut that he was being unsystematic. They all had a look and they said he's very extremely thorough. And he actually, what he does in that book, he says, this is why I say you might get lost in that book, because in that book he says, this is what they say. And he's talking about the philosophers. And then he puts their whole argument about what they say. And through their whole argument about what they say, then he says, this is what we say. But if they say this, this is what we say. And if they say that, this is what we hold. And if they get to that point, and I understand that point, he's essentially in the book saying, I know what you're talking about, and I'm going to show you I know what you're talking about by actually writing in the book that I know exactly what you mean, but here's why you're wrong. That's the concept. That's how he writes it. He actually states what their argument is, and he's actually telling them, I know what you are saying. And then he works from that viewpoint. Nobody ever said to Ghazali that you are ill-conceived or you work ad hoc or unsystematic. Every single one of the academics have all held him again in that highest regard. And they knew that Ghazali was not saying I am anti-philosophy. He isn't anti-philosophy, he isn't anti-rationalist, but he was saying that you are being unreasonable. You are absolutely being unreasonable, and they were being very, very unreasonable. If you look at the type of things that we have today, if you wanted to apply some of Ghazali's concepts, so we have a theory now in science that they call the Big Bang theory, or they've taken it as the Big Bang model. So that model now is the model that scientists generally hold on to. The fact that this universe was created from a bang that happened, and it was created from a singularity. And basically what that shows, actually that holds that the universe was created. So you get Stephen Hawking and some other physicists who come on and they say that there's an M theory and there's string theory. And they come up with this theory, but they're being unreasonable because there's no way that you can look outside of this universe. Paul Davies, who's a physicist, he said that what they say about M theory and string theory, because what they try and do, and Ghazali makes a very good point here, all they are trying to do is run away. They are trying to prove that the universe is eternal, because if they prove that the universe is eternal, then you don't need God. That's in their mind, right? Remember that example I gave you about infinite regress, how I told you it will factor in? If the universe is eternal in their minds, according to the philosophers, you no longer need God. And so that what Ghazali was saying in essence is that he's saying you're being unreasonable. And today when that people advocate M theory, string theory to try and get away from the eternality of God, or they try and escape from the concept of God, they're being very, very unreasonable. And that's what Ghazali was saying. You are being unreasonable. Paul Davies called it pseudoscience, child science. Because no one can ever possibly look outside of this universe, and you can't test something like that. You can't know something like that. So you're not actually talking science, you're talking pseudoscience. And Paul Davies is a great physicist, one of the world's greatest physicists. He used to work in Macquarie University, but he's in a university in America. He's written many books, and he is indeed one of the great physicists today. So in essence, Ghazali, he writes this book, and this book becomes a real sort of bedrock in essence, which is a rebuttal against the philosophers. So I won't talk too much more about that, but to say that he wrote many books. Again, as we said, he wrote books on politics, ethics, law, jurisprudence, logic, and countless others. Again, 200 books at the age of 55, which is a fact that you should not forget. Around 200 books. Around 200 books, and he only lived till 55 years of age. What an extraordinary life that he had. What an extraordinary life. So, we're coming on 1 o'clock. What I'm going to say in this, I wanted to leave you with something before everybody went away from today's lecture. I really hope that you've gained a little bit about Ghazali. I really hope. I've tried to pick very important things, very significant things in his life. So I've picked a passage out of his book that I want to tell you in terms of, and share with you in terms of what he says about the soul, in terms of what he says about the ruh, or the self. So Ghazali, he says that the soul will never be free of the temptation to sin. He says the soul will never be free of the temptation to sin. In saying that, the Prophet ﷺ also said, has anybody ever walked on water whose feet did not become wet? He said, likewise, the son of Adam لا يسلم من الذنوب. He can't be free. He can't be free from sin. But it doesn't mean that you're free to sin. That's not the point here. The point is that that hadith is meant as a measure of hope and beseeching Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rahmah. So you think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's punishment before you commit the sin, and you think of the mercy after, not the opposite way around. Does that make sense? Think of his punishment first, his rahmah later. But if you think of his mercy first, you're in trouble. So he said the soul will never be free from the temptation to sin, nor of being remiss or negligent of God's right. So he's saying your soul's always going to be tempted to sin, but also your soul in some way will never completely be free of that negligence of God's right. So in some way there will be that there are those competing things, right? The temptation to sin, but the friction or the pull to do good. So there's going to be that battle. So he said pretty much this: if you neglect yourself, if you neglect your ruh, if you neglect your soul, okay, if you neglect your soul, what you've done, if you have facilitated it to embark upon sin. So if you neglect your soul, you have given your body, your soul, a leg up to go and commit sin. If you neglect it, you can't neglect yourself. If you neglect yourself, you open the door of temptation to commit sin. That's what he said. He said, and what happens then? It becomes habitual. It becomes a habit. Okay? So it will become a habit. So what he's saying in essence, that the soul has something about it. All right? It's tempted to sin, but it's also not totally negligent of God. If you neglect your soul, what will happen if you neglect it? You're basically given a green light to commit sin. If you neglect it. That's what you're saying. You're almost opening the door. And what you do then is, he said, it becomes habitual. It will become habitual. And once it becomes habitual, he said, it is difficult to stop it. He said it is difficult to shed it away from your soul. Difficult to shed away, or to shed it, or to stop it. He said that this can lead ruin of the soul. This can lead to ruin. This can lead to ruin. And so then he says the soul needs, as a result or consequently, the soul needs to be disciplined. The soul needs to be disciplined. The nafs needs to be disciplined. Let's go through those steps once more, just in case you didn't get it down. So neglecting your soul gives rise to temptation to sin. If that's the case, it may become habitual. It will become therefore difficult to shed. This will cause ruin, or may cause ruin in your soul. And what he said is then, therefore, the remedy for that is that you have to intake or embark upon some type of discipline to the self. Now in his book, and I want to show you in his book, in one of his books, one of his 40 books, he mentions a hadith. Now I want just to say that a lot of in the Ihya Ulumuddin, what Imam Ghazali does, he mentions a lot of hadith which are also for targhib, are also for the purposes of really encouraging others. And so some scholars have looked at some hadith and they say that chain is weak, or that chain is weak, or that chain is weak, or that hadith is weak. But in reality, that Imam al-Ghazali in his Ihya can't really be criticized, because if you look at the madhabs do allow the usage of certain hadith if it means to encourage a particular person, or if it means that hadith is going to be used as an encouragement. If he had used a hadith that was mawdu', which was fabricated, I would have said that their claim and their criticism is warranted. But he didn't use any hadith that was mawdu', but rather some hadith that he did have may have been, in a sense, may have been weak, but it doesn't mean that he wasn't permitted to use them. In fact, the madhabs do hold that people can use a hadith if it's for encouragement, provided it doesn't fall upon halal and haram. So let's say that you were going to give a fatwa, you wouldn't give somebody a fatwa or a legal ruling if it was based upon a hadith that was rendered weak. But if you were going to encourage somebody to do good and you use the hadith, then there is no problem if you use that hadith, even if it was weak, but to encourage that individual. Does that make sense? So Ghazali, he holds this hadith in his book, and he says, it is told that Hassan Abi Sunan, he was passing by a dwelling and he muttered when was this built? So he's just talking about how a person reproaches himself, how a person comes back to himself. So then after he says that within himself, he muttered, when was this built? A new house. So something that caught his eye, right? Something that caught his eye. So what he did, he addressed his ruh and he addressed his soul, and he said, you ask about things that do not concern you, I will punish you with a year of fasting. I will punish you with a year of fasting. He gives an example. I'm saying the ihya is about coming alive. And I'm not saying that go for a year of fasting, but I want you to take the picture, right? I want you to take the picture. I want you to see what Ghazali is doing. There was Wahab bin Munabih, who was al-Yamani. He related a man, and this is the hadith, he related that a man prayed for a long time. So there was once a man who prayed for a long time, and he had a need. He had a need from God. There was a need, something that he wanted. So he started fasting every Saturday for 70 Saturdays. He started fasting every Saturday for 70 Saturdays. For 70 Saturdays. Then what happened was that he asked, and on those days, he only ate 11 dates. On each of those days, he only ate 11 dates. So then he asked for what he needed. He asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for what he needed. So this is a person who had a need. And just let me stop there for a second, and that's very important. I just want to stop there for a second. Isn't it sad that only when something happens, people reach out and ask Allah? You know, almost it's like you're being fake. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala encourages that. You always call upon Allah. But I'm talking about you, the individual here. I'm talking about the perception. Don't you always want to be, always have that feeling of, you know, of connection, as opposed to only when you need something, then you connect? It's very important that you always be in that sort of frame of mind, even when you may not have an urgent need. You may not have something urgent that's happening that's affecting your life. But often you see people only when something happens, or when they're about to do something or go on a journey or madri show, what happens in the end, they start asking Allah more and more and more and more. I mean, this should be a constant practice of our lives. So this man, he fasted every Saturday for 70 Saturdays, eating only 11 dates in each day. Then he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for what he wanted. He asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for what he wanted. And then what happened is that it was not granted to him. It wasn't granted. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not give him what he asked for. He didn't give him what he asked for. So then what he said, he came back to himself. He came back to his ruh. And he said to himself, he said, I will do away with you. He's saying to his ruh, I'm going to do away with you. If you had any good in you, you would have been granted your request. Now he reproached himself and he said, if I had any good in me, I would have been given the request. So the hadith states that an angel descended upon him and said, O son of Adam, Ya ibn Adam, this hour of yours, this one moment of self-reflection was more valuable than all your days of fasting. Was more valuable than all your days of fasting. And he said, God has granted your request. What I wanted to basically show you is, and just give you some of the things, just some of the reflective points, but some of the ways in which to internalize and perceive our life. Ghazali really was a giant. He was a giant. And most of the people really, in terms of Ghazali, are intellectual dwarfs. They are intellectual dwarfs in terms of comparison, in terms of Imam al-Ghazali. He was an absolute giant. And the one gift that he wanted you to have, this is the one gift that he wanted you to have, was the ihya. And he says, and he mentions in many of his books and many of his writings, that in essence it's a gift in terms of he wants you to go through the same thing that he went through. So in essence, it's almost like a gift from the man to you. That's what he went through. That's the path and journey that he undertook. So that's his gift. That's what he wants. He wants you to experience a total and complete transformation. And that's his gift. He wants you to taste that. And that's why you see him writing the letters to his students. That's why you see him writing the way that he does. So I hope we take away, and we have taken away from this lecture. I know that the dhuhr is coming, and I've exceeded my time, but to say that really stick to your mashayikh who are espousing the opinions of Imam al-Ghazali. I know that's a bit biased, but guess what? He is, I'll tell you, he will be relevant because of his teachings. He will be relevant for all time because he deals very much with an issue that will always have the same problem, because again, the constants in the human condition doesn't change. And again, this is what he found on his journey. This is what he wants to impart to you and I. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept our gathering. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put barakah and khair in our gathering. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept this gathering. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not allow us to depart from this gathering, except that our sins are forgiven, and accept that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has accepted our coming together. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive our brothers and sisters who have passed before us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala take us to that which pleases Him and keep us away from that which displeases Him. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا يا مولانا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين سبحانك وبحمدك لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. جزاكم الله كل خير.